In this video, we'll be exploring how to use vacuum, or the lack of pressure, to separate a liquid from a solid. It's sometimes called gravity filtration because we're also going to use gravity as a way to separate the two as well. Let's get started. One of the things that you're going to need for this technique is called a side-arm flask. Noted because it's got a side arm. Make sure that the size of your flask meets the volume of your liquid. You'll need a rubber hose to connect your flask to a sink. You'll need a filter. Now, different types of filter depending on the size of your particles of the solid. This is called a ground glass filter, so called because the inside has ground glass particles packed together. This filter will use a rubber gasket. Today we'll be using the Hirsch funnel. It is a ceramic filter with holes in the bottom. This type of filter uses a filter paper. So make sure you grab a filter paper. You will weigh the filter paper and record that mass in your lab book. Fit the flask with the funnel. The funnel will probably have a stopper already attached. A cool thing about the Hirsch funnel, it's actually made by Coors, the beer company. Turns out years ago they were trying to find a proprietary mix of ceramics in order to brew beer so it wouldn't taste funny. Well, at the high temperatures that they used, they really needed a really special mix of ceramics. Turns out that this mix of ceramics is great for chemistry as well. So they actually started making chemistry products and selling it to teachers and labs. Once you've fitted it on there, make sure it's a tight fit. Sometimes what I'd like to do is take a little bit of water on the end of my finger and wet the rubber gasket. And that makes for a tighter fit. Then connect the hose to the side arm. This sometimes makes the flask and the filter contraption a little wobbly. So what I like to do is stabilize the whole thing with a ring stand. Now, at this point, you're going to take the other end of the hose and connect it to the sink. But be careful, you don't want to connect it to just any part of the sink. The sink that you need is one that has a valve which lets water down, but there's also a side valve. Well, when you turn on the water, notice how water goes down, but no water comes out the side. Actually, air is being pulled in from the side and helps the water rush down. This is the port that you'll be using to connect your hose. What you want to do is test it before you actually filter. Again, using a pre-weighed filter paper, gently put it down into the filter flask. You want to make sure it's as flush with the bottom as possible. Using distilled water or the solvent you'll be using to rinse your solid with, wet the paper with a few drops. Sometimes the liquid that we have in the solid is not water but some other liquid. In that case, you'll be wetting the paper with that liquid. Then turn on the sink and watch to see if the water or liquid that you've added does get aspirated down into the sidearm flask. If it's not aspirating like it should, adjust the flask and perhaps maybe even re-wet the gasket to make sure you truly have an airtight fit. The air being pulled by the running water of the faucet should help vacuum or create less pressure in the flask, thereby allowing the atmospheric pressure to push the liquid through the filter paper. And since solids hopefully are a grain size larger than your filter paper, it should get caught on your filter paper. You want to make sure you capture as much solid as possible. So taking your beaker of mixture, swirl it around to capture all the side particles of the flask. Then quickly dump all of your mixture into the filter flask. Now, I still see some solid in here. Remember, we want to get as much of the solid as possible. It can affect your percent yield in your lab. So, grabbing the liquid that you're using, go ahead and gently squirt a few drops into your flask. Swirl it to try to capture as much of the solid as you can, and again, dump it quickly into your filter. Now sometimes when you're done, you might get some product clinging to the side of the filter. Again, using your trusty squirt bottle, or again, the liquid you're using, wash the sides of the filter down to ensure that all the solid gets captured onto that filter paper. Now, at this point, you might notice that some of the solid got through and entered your flask. Easy to solve. What you can do is disconnect the filter, take this liquid, pour it into a flask, and then refilter it to try to capture as much of the solid as possible. So just because it went down into the sidearm flask doesn't mean it's lost forever. Using a spatula, gently lift the filter paper out from the filter. A watch glass does a great job of acting as a plate. Carefully scoop out your product and the filter paper onto the watch glass. If any of your product gets left behind, go ahead and scoop that too. Now again, it doesn't matter where on the watch glass it lands, because we've pre-weighed our watch glass, right? Looks kind of damp and goopy. Probably not the most accurate time to take a mass. This is where heat comes into play. We'll be using a heat lamp to gently dry off any of the liquids that might be remaining in our product. Make sure that when you finally take the mass of your product, you want to take the mass when the product is as dry as possible. We don't want the liquid, we want to know how much solid you made. One of the things you want to keep in mind is look at the melting point of your solid. Sometimes the heat lamp might be a little too intense for your product, so keep that in mind. We have now separated our solid from our liquid. Success!